This is Writer to Writer. I'm Charlie Patton, your host, and with me today is Doug Marlette, Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist and now a novelist. We're going to talk about cartoons and books. Doug, excuse me. You have been your first venture into this business was as an editorial cartoonist, and you started at in Tallahassee as a student, right?
Well, I did actually. I did for the Tallahassee paper there and for the Florida State Flambeau. But I actually started working for the Orlando Sentinel before that when I was a teenager. I've drawn for newspapers since I was 16. I sold my first cartoon to the Sanford Herald.
Really? What was your first cartoon, you remember?
It was a sports cartoon. My brother took my cartoons down to the sports editor and showed them to him.
Right. Now, in your novel, The Bridge, one of the main character is a editorial cartoonist, and he describes himself as having a gift for pissing people off. Is that what makes a great editorial cartoonist?
I don't know if it's what, but it certainly is something that has I've noted about a lot of good cartoonists that seem to have an instinct for going to the core of the truth of the matter. It's the emperor has no clothes phenomenon. But it's cute in a 4-year-old. But when in adults, people don't like it sometimes, and so people complain about cartoons or they get upset about drawings.
There's an incident that opens your book, which I believe is based on something that actually happened to you. A cartoon that you drew for Long Island Newsday,
right.
Which is the paper has a different name in the book, but clearly is the same paper.
I used that to launch this character, South. Although he handles the situation that I was in differently. I have Pitt Cantrell as the character, who's a political cartoonist. He draws a cartoon like the one I did of the Pope, with after he had reiterated his opposition to women priests, and I had just a close-up of the Pope with an arrow pointing to his head that said, "Upon this rock I will build my church."
Right.
Well, in my experience, and I reiterate this in the book, it lit up the phone lines at Newsday like the night sky over Baghdad, and with complaints and all that, and it caused this furor. Now, what I experienced there was that and it was the first for me because I'd drawn for years at the Charlotte Observer and the Atlanta Constitution in these southern newspapers in the Bible Belt, and I never had anybody apologize for a cartoon, and the Newsday apologized for it and ran the apology on the op-ed page of the paper, and then they offered me the opportunity to respond to the apology, which I did, and it irritated my publisher, who called me in.
He was irritated about your response.
Yeah, he was irritated by the response and put me on probation, whatever that means. But I guess that meant I couldn't chew gum in class. I used that incident because it was an interesting thing, and I always wondered what would have happened if instead of the affable, amiable, civilized Doug Marlette had not shown up, but if Pitt Cantrell, the lint-head boy, which is kind of my background, the kind of southern.
From the southern mill towns.
From the southern mill towns. If he had been there, and so he beats up his publisher with his own yachting trophy.
Thoroughly beats him up.
He thoroughly, with his. The part I like is the yachting trophy. He uses the publisher's yachting trophy, and this launches him. He of course is disgraced and humiliated, which is why I didn't do it.
But you do fulfill the dream of most newspaper people, which is to go beat up the publisher or the editor.
I've found that not only is that a dream of newspaper people, but it's almost a universal. This is a universal dream of people from all. I guess that's how we get the comic strip Dilbert. This is in corporate America. That is a constant. Is
that the most controversial cartoon you've ever drawn?
I had lots of controversy as the title of the gift for pissing people off. I've had hate mail and controversy since I was 21 years old. I've been attacked by right-wing fundamentalists. The Jerry Falwell and Jim Baker, when I was in Charlotte, that's doing cartoons on that. I would have the followers of Jim and Tammy Faye Baker would call me up when I do drawings. They'd hold the cartoon up on PTL and say I was a tool of Satan, and they would tell people to call in. And people would call in and say, "You're a tool of Satan." I would say, that's impossible, because the Charlotte Observer Personnel Department gives tests to every employee, and they try to screen for tools of Satan. Knight Ridder has a policy against hiring tools of Satan.
Yeah.
But I've gotten that. It's just part of the. It's part of the job, and you expect it if you're doing your job. Then if you're expressing opinions visually, graphically, then people are going to have strong opinions. That's the great thing about America, is we can express our opinions, and you don't apologize for them. That's
I know in your response to the Newsweek, not Newsweek, Newsday controversy, the editor said it was a mistake to run them, and you said, how is it ever a mistake to express an opinion?
Exactly, and where I came from, you don't apologize for opinions. That's why we have a First Amendment. So anyway, my career has been kind of, dealing with these issues, and what I've noticed, what's interesting is that the kinds of reactions that or the people who don't quite grasp that. And sometimes it can be journalists, oddly, that people generally believe in free speech for themselves and not for others. Sure. And in other words, if I express strong opinions, I expect that people are not going to like it, and they can express theirs, and they should and do. And that's kind of what we hope for. And I think that's what the Founding Fathers hoped for, is that if enough of us are talking about issues and expressing things, then the majority of us will come up with the correct solutions to the problems facing a republic.
Is it getting harder to express opinions in newspapers?
I think newspapers are becoming more timid. I think that's part of the corporatization and homogenization. Also, the cartoonists in general as a tribe are becoming more timid. There's kind of an Eddie Haskell school of cartooning, I always call it. Remember in Leave It to Beaver, when Eddie Haskell was always saying what the parents wanted. My Mrs. Cleaver, you certainly look lovely today. Well, there are cartoonists who do that with publishers and kind of give them pablum and boring cartoons, because that's what publishers want. They don't want anything brought up. They don't really want the hate mail. It's more important to run the efficient machine running. The bureaucratic imperative is more important. Efficiency, then it's untidy and messy to have people calling in and complaining, and you might lose advertisers.
Now, this is a very select fraternity you're in. I mean, there's not a lot of editorial cartoonists because there are not a lot of jobs for editorial.
That's right, and it's shrunk in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, there were a couple of hundred cartoonists, and now there are less than 90.
Now, and you were able, when you chose to leave Newsday, and you were able to land a position with another paper, or the paper offered you the perch, and I imagine you make most of your income from syndication rather than from the Tallahassee.
Well, you want a newspaper, but for me it was important also to have the freedom to do. To live where I wanted to live, and to be in the virtual office aspect.
Well, let's go to the bridge now, because the character in the bridge doesn't have the same opportunity. He doesn't have a perch to go to, so he moves back home to a town that very much resembles Hillsborough, North Carolina, which is where you live, and begins exploring his past. And the book becomes in its second half of the book, it's basically about him coming to terms with his past, his grandmother, and the events.
Well, there's an autobiographical element, and I guess there is a lot of times with writers for their first novel. But for me, especially, I learned I was in my late 30s or 40s when I discovered that my grandmother had been bayoneted by National Guardsmen during a mill strike, and this totally stunned me. And my grandmother, you have to understand, was this blue-haired Ayatollah, as Pitt Cantrell describes her. She was this, just a holy terror. She dipped snuff and packed heat, carried a .38 in a purse, and just dominated my father's family. And I was terrified of her as a child. She was a black belt in passive aggression, and kind of could weep at will, a museum of hysterical symptoms. And she just loomed large in my imagination. It's kind of all that I wanted to get away from when I was a kid. So you can imagine when I started drawing cartoons, making trouble on newspaper editorial pages for a long time, and thought that my art and cartoons had, allowed me to escape the family. When I discovered that my grandmother had this history, and that was all a buried history, when we moved back to Hillsborough from New York, and all these stories began pouring out, and I learned that my grandmother and grandfather had worked in the mills in Hillsborough, in the town that was living in now, and that I had bought this house, this old historic home in Hillsborough, about a mile from the mill village where my grandparents worked, and my father had been baptized in the Eno River, and all this family history, and was not aware of. And I walked into it, and I started learning about the uprising of '34, which was the mill strike she was involved in, which was the largest strike in American history.
You're talking about textile mills.
Textile mills, cotton mills, yeah. That I don't know if your viewers would know this, but in the South after the Civil War, really textiles reinvigorated the South after the calamity of the Civil War, and it became this huge industry and my people worked in the cotton mills, and I knew that, but I did not know that this event that I learned about, which was probably one of the most important unknown events in American history. It was put down 3 weeks in 1934, probably the closest thing to a revolution this country's ever faced. 500,000 textile workers went out, and my family was right in the middle of it, and this was all unknown to me. So this is interesting to me as in my 40s, discovering these things, and also especially with this grandmother figure who had always been anathema to me. To discover
your actual grandmother was named Grace Pickard?
Grace Pickard.
Right, and that's where Pickard gets.
Yeah, so I use that name. Yeah, I use that name.
You call her Miss Lucy in the book.
Yeah, right.
And she becomes actually one of the leaders of this strike.
Right. And this is, I took what I learned from her. I began looking into it myself and discovering all sorts of things about my family and about her. And I interviewed her, my grandmother, and got lots of, and this is in the early 90s, and I didn't know I was going to write a novel about it, but I just knew that there was an interesting story that I was just, for myself, interested in tracking. And I began investigating and reading, and it all came pouring out. And I think the moment when I discovered the house that I bought is this old historic home in the center of Hillsborough, which used to be the provisional capital of North Carolina, and all the founding fathers of the state kind of lived there. And the man who built the house I bought was one of the founding fathers. He laid the railroads. He helped the University of North Carolina. His portrait hangs there in the Philanthropic and Dialectic Society meeting house, where Thomas Wolfe said that one day his portrait would hang there, and it does. But there next to it is Paul Cameron's portrait. Cameron Boulevard runs through the middle of campus. Paul Cameron built the house that I bought. When I learned, I think this was when I realized I had a novel, when I learned that the man who built the house I lived in had also financed the mills in Burlington, where my grandmother was bayoneted, and in Hillsborough, where my people worked. It suddenly dawned on me that the grandson of a lint head, of a cotton mill worker, had moved into the mill owner's house. Okay. And I thought, there's a story here, and there's this kind of a circle here, and I wanted to figure out a way to tell it.
Now we haven't even touched yet on the third thing you do, which is you draw the comic strip Kudzu,
right,
which is a very successful. It's syndicated in about 300 newspapers. I understand. Where does a guy that's doing an editorial cartoon a day and a comic strip a day find the time and the ambition to write a novel?
Well, this is clearly nothing that a little Ritalin couldn't take care of. But I think for me, and I see all of this as one thing, but for me, I fell in love with the power of single images and that's what political cartooning for me in the 1960s kind of excited me and thrilled me when I got into it. And I've done that for all these years. I still do it 5 days a week. And then the comic strip started about 10 years after that. 20 years ago, I had early in my life been in love with comic strips, and I wanted to see if I could do it. But if you think of it as single images, kind of the hole-in-one for a political cartoon is the single image, wordless, and then multiple panels and story and characters that started moving towards language for me, I think. And then now, then we did a play, a musical based on Kudzu, and that we did at Ford's Theater in Washington.
And Kudzu, we should say for people that don't know the strip, it's again about small town.
In the small towns in the South, a town called awkward teenage boy with a cast of characters in a little town called Bypass. Which is probably the
highways past
everything that didn't get an exit. So all of that was kind of dealing with, and it was interesting to me that I had Kudzu want to be a writer in the very first week of the strip, and long before I knew that I wanted to be a writer. But then doing moving towards writing and towards the novel, and was by way of playwriting and that sort of thing. I was moving towards language, I think, and the things that you can get at in fiction that you can't get in cartoons. When you do journalism, as you know, you get this you get that. You can conceive of the whole thing. You can write it in a day, in an afternoon. It appears in the paper the next day. I mean,
Right.
it's a great cartoon is kind of like a slam dunk. The novel is a totally different. It's a long-term process. It takes years to write, and you don't know.
How long did The Bridge
It took me
take
about
you?
4 years, but I was doing it in the margins and seams of all these deadlines. I was getting up early in the morning and writing. And
So did you actually set out a schedule for yourself?
I just, I'd learned that it was more practical. It's all practical. If I'm going to get this done, I need a couple of hours before everybody gets up in the morning. So I'd get up around 4:30 or 5 and write for a couple of hours, and then I would double up on deadlines to get finished with all my week's work by Thursday, so I'd have Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So, that kind of thing for several years.
Right. Now, I know you're close friends with the novelist Pat Conroy.
Yeah, Pat and I are good friends.
Terrific novelist.
Yeah.
Did you go to him and ask for practical tips? How does one write a novel?
In a way, I think that just accrued over years of talking. We talk fairly frequently about everything from basketball to to the politics, whatever's going on.
Right.
Pat doesn't talk a lot. Interestingly, there was never so much. I would ask questions, but again, for years before how do you decide? What do you those kinds of things. It wasn't with the intent of that, but I think I absorbed a lot from watching and listening, and over the years, us just talking about writing and books that we've read, and what it is about art and about writing, but not necessarily straight up. One of the things I've learned about Pat is that writing for him is really his religion. It's a deep and personal, private thing for him. He does not, so I always would pay attention if he started talking about writing, because it was like, it is not something he brings out.
Not something he would normally talk about.
Right.
Okay. Did you find that the story came pretty naturally?
Yeah, no, I tell you, it was interesting. I knew I had a story about. I knew the more that I accrued information about this uprising and what happened, and I was reading these academic works talking about this thing that I had a personal connection to, but I kept noticing that in the academic text, they were beating the life out of the story, that they were reporting astonishing things, dramatic things, but you couldn't feel the thing. Right. And I wanted to see if I could find a way to show it in that way, but I was looking at it the way I was looking. I was thinking there's a story back in 1934 with these people. It was when we were doing our kudzu show. I met this director of musicals who heard me talking about my grandmother and told me that he would give me a contract for a screenplay right then, because he worked for Warner Brothers. He said, "That's a great story." I said, "Yeah." I said, "No, I don't want to do a movie script. I want to do it as a novel." I said, "I've just got to figure out the story." And he said the thing that made me see this. He said, "It's your story. That's the story." And so instead of looking back at it that way, he was looking at me looking back at it. Okay. And then suddenly I saw the beginning and the end of the novel.
Which is how you tell the story. You have Pick Cantrell go back to this town and begin to slowly get his grandmother to tell him the story.
Right.
And you flash back and forth between Pick and the current time,
in the present and in the past.
Miss Lucy in the past.
Right, and then all I needed was, and then I needed a launch out of New York for Pick, and I knew how to do that. So.
Right, which is.
But I knew the beginning and the middle. I didn't know the middle. I knew that as I said to this director, I said, you don't understand. I did not like my grandmother. He said, all the better. And so I knew I had a place to go with him not liking, and then kind of falling in love with his grandmother by the end of it.
Now the novel, probably surprisingly to you, has engendered some controversy in your hometown. Some of the characters, Pat Conroy talked about Thomas Wolfe in one of the quotes he gave you for the book. And I grew up in Asheville, which was Thomas Wolfe's home, and people 50 years later still didn't speak to Thomas Wolfe's family because they felt that the portraits he had drawn had been too vivid,
close to the bone,
too close to the bone. You've had some of that come up, people thinking that they have been maligned.
Interesting, and they were writers. The interesting thing that people like yourself or me, you've read about Thomas Wolfe, you know the stories.
Right.
I would be slow to try to suppress a book or something, but the folks who, a writer named Alan Gurganus decided that a character was him. He appropriated the character. which was interesting because, for instance, Pat
Conroy's
Conroy's
sister also thought
it was
character
Pat. You know,
was Pat,
but I think it was Alan was trying to make my book be about him, and that's essentially. And there was a kind of a rampant immaturity that erupted in the town, and several writers, Lee Smith, her husband Hal Crowther, bashed the book a lot around the country. But
and we should point out because there was those complaints that the book did win the Southeastern Booksellers Association award as Novel of the Year.
Well, I think everyone else saw that, and it was well received in the town itself with the regular people. But the writers seemed to not understand what, for instance, my family. If anyone were angry, if anyone were angry about my book, it seems to me it'd be me because of the character of Pit Cantrell. It's not very flattering.
No, he's not.
And if anybody should be upset, but I understand what fiction is, and that's not me. And I would not have thought that writers would do that, but my family, who maybe because of the portrait of my grandmother, but they were magnificent, they were great, and they seemed to grasp what Thomas Wolfe said when he said that the sculpture should not be mistaken for the clay from which it is formed. And there's a big difference.
But you do run that risk when you have as many autobiographical elements. I mean, Pit Cantrell has a lot of incidents.
Exactly. I understand it. I understand it, and it certainly is. But I have a fluid ability to do that, and I would think any artist, especially, would do that. But that happened with Wolfe. I always liked what Thomas Wolfe's mother said when a woman, and this happened a lot in Hillsborough. Kind of people lets you and him fight. Kind of people got off on people not getting along. But a woman called Thomas Wolfe's mother and said, after Look Homeward Angel came out, and said, wasn't that awful what your son wrote about you? And she had the greatest answer. She said, "That wasn't me."
Yeah, well,
which is too bad the writers of Hillsborough couldn't muster that kind of sophistication.
That I don't know whether that controversy was what led to this, but you had an incident with the Today Show chose not to let Pat Conroy introduce your book on its book club, which and I don't know if that was because
I have no idea, but there has been such a weird. There's been I'm not sure what all of that is. There are lots of ways of looking at these things. I think it's irritating to people that a cartoonist is writing a novel. I mean, that's
irritating to writers.
And I think there's some of that. I've even had booksellers who love my book and sold a lot of my books and voted it the best book. But they even mentioned, they said, well, it's just, I think people have a hard time when people move from one. We want to think of everyone in their pigeonholes and my whole job is thinking outside the box or breaking down. I do not think of the novel as much different from the cartooning or the comic strip. It's all one thing. It's expressing, finding the best way. When I was a kid and I was fascinated learning to draw cartoons, I was fascinated as we all become in the techniques. And I remember studying what all the cartoonists use and what kind of pen and brush they use. And I remember reading Jules Feiffer saying, when someone asked him what pens he used, he said, I use a popsicle stick or a shoe brush, whatever's at hand. He was kind of satirizing the question, but I've realized the genius of that is that it's not, the magic is not in the brush or the pen, and it's not even in the form. It's just whether or not there's an energy and a life in it, and so just as I don't really care what the technique is. The form, whether it's political cartoons, comics, I love it all, and I'm trying to express myself.
Do you see yourself writing more novels?
Yeah, I'm working on one now. Yeah, I like it. I like it is a completely different. It's that if a political cartoon is like a slam dunk, then the novel is like the entire basketball program. It's such a different and long term. And satisfying. You can kind of get at the bittersweet aspect of life. You can get at more things. There's more room to explore. Faulkner said that writing a novel is like going across country at night, and all you can see is the light in your headlights. The car. It's an act of faith, and you never know if it's going to work or anything. So it's a long kind of a. Postponed gratification.
You don't get that instant gratification you get with a political cartoon.
Right, that's right. You don't get that, or in journalism in general. And you also, in journalism with a story or anything, you can kind of understand what the whole thing is. With a novel, and you don't know. And it's really an act of faith and takes a kind of a patience.
And you've had a musical. You've written a musical, Kudzu
Right.
musical, which we referred to earlier.
Right.
You've written a screenplay, I know, with Pat Conroy,
Yeah.
which hasn't been produced.
Right.
There's talk that there may be a movie of The Bridge. I don't know if
Yeah.
you're going to be involved in
No,
that.
you know,
or
I
not.
didn't, but I heard last night, actually, that the screenwriter, a man named Mark Andrus, just will be finished with the screenplay soon.
Right.
He wrote As Good as It Gets, and Oscar nominated.
Okay.
But no, I'm not especially interested. That's really collaborative, and it's really more about commerce and art. I only want to do the things that I can have some control over.
But
know.
you still get the kick out of sitting down at the drawing board
Yeah.
every day and turning out, well, you're turning out a cartoon, two different
Yeah.
cartoons a day.
Right. Yeah, and I really like that. And there are different means of expression. And you get with the novel, you get the satisfactions, these little private satisfactions of solving little problems or finding the right word or something. And
Right.
over a long time, what you don't know though is whether the whole thing works and whether it has any kind of cumulative power. Or
You have to wait for the reviews.
you have to
decide
wait,
that.
and even that you don't know. It's such a solitary thing. It's very interesting.
Well, thank you very much, Doug.
Thanks.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you. This has been Writer to Writer. Thank you very much.